Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those all around the world tuning in. I'm Alan Marcus, as you just heard, and this is the session on sharpening the focus on privacy through COVID-19. We have two very important guests. Of course, first is our executive chairman, Gunjan Sinha, and he will be joined by Jade Nestor, the director of consumer policy at the GSM Association, which, if you're not familiar, is the community of global telecom providers and internet providers focused on improving operations and initiatives around the world. So let me welcome then Gunja and Jade to join me in this session. Thank you both for joining. So let's just get right into it. Privacy through COVID-19. Jade, maybe I start with you. When I think of the opportunities and challenges we see during this pandemic, it certainly becomes very clear. Data is super important. One of the biggest challenges we see, of course, is do we know who has the disease and where they are and who they've infected? Many people have thought through this and said, well, maybe we should be using mobile data from the telecom providers. So how do we think in terms of using that kind of information while still providing the necessary structures for privacy to make sure we're not being intrusive?
Sure, yes. And this is something, of course, we've been thinking a lot about. The GSMA has over 700 members, which are mobile network operators around the world. We also have 400 associate members who represent various other parts of the mobile ecosystem. So the types of data sets that our companies have access to are wide ranging. And many of the companies, if not all, have been thinking about how to leverage that data for COVID-19 response. When we talk about mobile data, I do think it's helpful to clarify the different types of data at a high level. There's mobile network data about connections to the towers. So that records if there's been an SMS or a call made and which tower that connected to. And that data itself is not very granular in terms of location. It might be as granular as showing that someone was on a city street. So maybe 100-meter type accuracy. And then there's GPS data, which is generated from the apps on the phone. So the mobile network operators don't necessarily have visibility of that GPS data, but stakeholders across the mobile ecosystem have access to GPS data, depending on the permissions that people set up. So in the context of COVID and contact tracing, which is when we are trying to figure out where people have been moving and what their behaviors have been, we can harness different types of data sets. So the apps that everyone has been developing, that I'm sure everyone has seen in the news, are looking at GPS. They're also looking at Bluetooth to see if you've been in proximity of someone who has potentially been infected. We're still seeing how those apps are going to play out. They need to be downloaded by a large portion of the population, and there have been a number of privacy concerns that have been raised about who has access to the underlying data about who's been infected and who they've been in proximity with. And then if we look back at the mobile data, the data about connections to the network, even though that data is less granular, it can still be used in privacy protective ways to figure out, for example, if containment measures put in place by the state have been effective. So our mobile operators in certain regions have been working with health authorities on that specific question. So before lockdown, what did movement look like? After lockdown, did look like? That can help the health authorities with planning. Also, for example, in Norway, the operator Telenor, even before they had any infections, was looking at aggregate movements of mobile data to ascertain what their infection spread could look like in the country, just based on those movements. And so they also have been working collaboratively with anonymized aggregated data. So they're not looking at any one individual, where any one individual is moving. They're looking at this high level data about where large groups of people are moving and then producing insights based on that. And in most cases, the insights that they're giving to the governments are in the form of a heat map or some sort of graph, so that you're not handing over a data set of anonymized and aggregated data. You're handing over something that's more workable. But that also seeks to minimize the amount of data that's transferred. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to think through how to do that in the best way. The GSMA has developed privacy guidelines, which are actually quite similar to other guidelines that regulators have produced around the world, including in Europe. And those guidelines talk about obligations for mobile operators, but also for governments, because ultimately the recipient of all these data is governments, their health authorities, and there are certain privacy and accountability and security requirements that they should be abiding by as well.
So, Gunjan, what I heard from Jade is a huge opportunity, a lot of places to look at the data, certainly ways to anonymize, to try and balance privacy. But when we think about that set of data and other sets of data that could be necessary, in my mind, it brings kind of the notion of a place to bring it to, a hub or a platform of sorts, where we can validate maybe compliance, maybe we can audit to see, are we following the rules we set forth? Talk us through kind of how that kind of could work in this respect.
No, and thanks, Alan, and really appreciated the comments from you, Jade. But I've been in metrics team. We've been thinking about the problems of GRC for the last almost 15 plus years, figuring out how does governance, risk, and compliance come together. But in this kind of COVID reality, and we are specifically just talking about in this case telecom and mobile operator data. So one of the things that comes out very clearly is 80%. I mean, this is a report from Pew Research. 80% of Americans actually feel that they see more risk in the privacy compromising risks of their data than they see the benefits of the data being used by other third parties like websites or e-commerce sites and so forth. So people are very skeptical about how their privacy is being compromised. So what we need to do as an industry and as a system is to think through, not inside out, but outside in, what would be an approach or a system that will allow us to build real kind of privacy at scale in the world of big data. So what we have done is embarked on a nonprofit initiative called mprivacy.org, and that's where Jade and I are collaborating. Jade is part of GSMA, and then our CTO Vidya Falke is involved, and we have researchers from MIT and other places. But the idea is, can you create a working group that tries to understand big data at scale, where imagine if mobile operators and telecom companies were contributing data, where you could actually do what I call input privacy and output privacy. Input privacy meaning at the point where the data is being submitted to a global hub, there is input privacy. That means you cannot relate this to a PII or a identifiable information relevant to a person. But there's also output privacy, so that you cannot have inadvertent leakage of the data set. So these are complex problems. So we are actually in early stages of designing that protocol or standard that we will actually publish it out for everybody to adopt, including the 700 mobile operators that organizations like GSMA and others govern. But the principles of what we are doing here for the world of mobile and telecom data are equally applicable for other verticals like financial services, like retail and others, where you can do ethical, privacy-preserving, risk-aware data exchange. And I think as we learn more, I'll be very happy to share what we learned, but we are taking a systems approach. We are taking, a privacy preserving approach and a risk aware approach. Over to you, Alan.
That's excellent. Certainly, as I've looked back over the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, I've seen a number of efforts to try and create this balance between the needs of government, of tracing, of access to movement, and the needs of the individual, the privacy. Certainly during the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa, there was a big call to try and use some of the mobile data. And looking back after the fact, we saw that there was an immense set of information that if we would have had a priori, before, or at least at the beginning, could have been helpful. Yet too many regulations, too many challenges kind of stopped it. Jade, what do you think is different now versus some of these attempts in the past? What are you thinking about in terms of privacy that can make a difference here that people will be more accepting of?
So we're really trying to look at how to implement data minimization, to Gunjan's point, to prevent any data leakage issues, looking at how to best harness privacy enhancing technologies. And I think that's one of the big differences, because that lets us conduct analytics on data without sharing the underlying data. And by underlying data in this case, I mean identifiable data about individuals, but then also even aggregated and anonymized use cases. Those can stay with the operator, but still provide benefits for governments. And one example that we've been talking about is the use of homomorphic encryption. So, for example, if a government has information about infected individuals with COVID, so through a voluntary contact tracing process, a manual process, they obtain a phone number and they want to know which area that person has been in. It's possible that they could ask the telco to, they send the phone number and then they say, send us back the location data about that one individual. And we're trying to build something where hypothetically, telco could come back and say, well, if you send us this encrypted data, then our system can be queried with that encrypted data without us actually seeing what the phone number is, because we don't necessarily need to see who's infected. But if you want to see at a high level which general areas some of these infected people have been in order to provide notifications to people that there is an outbreak in the area, or to conduct epidemiological surveillance, then we can send that data back to you. But we can do it so that it's all encrypted and we don't necessarily see those phone numbers and you don't necessarily see any data that you don't need to see either. We've also discussed adding differential privacy to this. And I think we've all seen these apps, for example, where they ask you to provide your symptoms. So a regular update of how you're feeling and your symptoms so that health authorities can track where the infections might be spreading before people are actually tested. So we're thinking through a solution where, especially for people who don't have access to apps and smartphones, and this is a critical point, there are still many people around the world who are at risk of COVID who do not have access to these apps. Those people could text their symptoms back, and that could be processed and noise can be added to the data so that the health authorities can still get important information about if an infection is spreading without seeing the identifiable information about those people, for example, without seeing the phone numbers. So that's something else that we're thinking about. So, there's this question of conducting analytics on these large data sets, and then there's the question of how we can use privacy enhancing technologies to still provide more granular information, but in a privacy protective way. And we're also, of course, looking at how consent can be rolled out, how to be transparent, how to make sure all of this data is only used for specific purposes and for specific timeframes to meet crises. All of this ultimately has to be to respect privacy practices, not just data minimization, but a whole range of privacy best practices. So these are all things that we're thinking through And I think that makes it different than, for example, in Ebola, where part of the question became who does the analytics. So even if the telco gets all of the data ready and provides it to a third party, could that data, for example, be re-identified by that third party? And even though we're looking at anonymized and aggregated data sets, if you have sophisticated analytics, there is sometimes a question of whether that data can be re-identified. So we're trying to take that problem out of the equation this time.
So that's incredible. And you talk about consent and transparency, which are really important of vectors when we think of trust. One of the challenges in any kind of system that you're describing is, of course, since it involves humans, people, do we trust it? Certainly, the trust model has broken a number of times in the past. Even quite recently, particularly with digital and online. So, certainly it sounds like you're moving in the right direction, but there's still always room for someone breaking that trust, for something maybe not working correctly. Are there specific areas, Jade, in terms of that trust model that you're using that can open up, that can be more audited, especially from a government or a business standpoint?
Well, there's the government and business standpoint, and then I think there's the large privacy advocacy and developer community who definitely clamors for more open source options. So I think as we build this, that looking at looping in those communities of developers who want to help and who want open source solutions is critical. And that basically is like a crowdsourced auditability in some way. But I think anything that we're proposing also needs to be integrated into a telco or a government's risk strategy and their compliance strategy. One thing that we've been looking at is trying to look at our basic tenets of the framework we're talking about and then map that to the new NIST privacy framework, which also has reference, of course, to security framework. So we're trying to look to see where those linkages are, which can help make it easier for organizations to figure out how this fits in to their existing GRC strategies. And I think you mentioned earlier, everyone is looking at their strategies right now as the data economy grows and as the nature of the economy changes. So this is something that we're also looking at and trying to make that as frictionless as possible for any stakeholders who be involved.
Gunjan, when I kind of think through this and kind of go back a little bit, we talk about bringing connectivity to everyone, with networks, computers. Then we push that to the edge now with mobile, and it's created a set of new kinds of challenges that went along as this technology has developed. And people started adapting, as Jade talked about, risk profiles and risk management from an enterprise standpoint, and maybe right up through now thinking in terms of cybersecurity as being a key factor. But now we're talking about broader sets of risks that now need to be managed, and I can't think of a better platform than MetricStream in terms of how to think in terms of governing that risk, measuring that risk, and creating the right kind of compliance around there. How does MetricStream, how do you start to think about this as businesses now start to think coming back to work, bringing people in? How do I protect and risk mitigate all of the issues now that this pandemic has created, not just now but in the future?
Yeah, no, Alan, and that's that's a very appropriate question, and especially for MetricStream, but also for this audience here, since we have risk and governance and compliance and privacy professionals from around the world. So the way I look at it, and I touched upon that day before when I was talking about kind of the waves of GRC. So as I said, back in 2008. That was because of the financial interconnectedness that really led to the financial risk. That was the start of the financial risk, and GRC kind of took its meaning and roots in the financial side. By, I said, 2015, the technological interconnectedness that, because of internet, mobile phones, cell phones, and others, that led to really the cyber risks. And, we've been working diligently and, with all of our customers and partners and the industry at large to propagate, how we can deal with and manage cyber risks. So that was the second wave of GRC. And I think the third wave of GRC just hit us, this year as COVID took roots, and that is the pandemic risk. And we recognize that we are biologically interconnected. So the society is not just financially interconnected, not just technologically interconnected, but we're also biologically interconnected. And that's our third risk, which is the biological risk, which is resulting into this pandemic. And GRC must get into understanding how it actually starts to offer solutions for mitigating and managing the biological risks in the society, in organizations, and for regulators and governments. And then the fourth wave of GRC that has yet to come, and I think to me, this COVID crisis is a rude awakening that fourth crisis is yet to come, that is the climate risk. We know that there is a connectedness of the global climate, and the climate risk management has to be part of the GRC strategy. So when I look at all of these four things, the financial, the technological, which is cyber, the pandemic, kind of dealing with the biological risks, and then the climate risks, we've got to be thinking about all of this stuff at the big data scale, because we're generating a lot of data. And then how do you do that in a privacy preserving way? That is what makes our jobs both interesting and hard, because you got to do and perform with integrity. That's our mission and motto. And how do you perform with integrity? So we've got to do that in a privacy preserving way where there's a real and fair data economics. Remember, I said, Pew Center said 80% of American citizens, this is a research just recently, 80% think that their data is being compromised and the risks are far greater than the benefit that individuals get, which is not right. We want it to be such where people see the risk benefit as balanced. So if you're going to use my data for safe distancing, or if you're going to do that, you want to make sure that you're getting the right benefit out of that. So as the markets open up, as businesses open up for COVID, we are building out solutions to help our customers, help our company, and help our industry so that we can go back to work in a safe way, but do that while being privacy preserving, while being ethical, so that companies can perform with integrity. And that is our goal. We've been working on a war footing since March, and this has been real hard work for a lot of people, and including, I personally would have talked to over 50 of our customers around the world who are contributing ideas to this. This is not just MetricStream employees or our partners, but also our customers are crowdsourcing ideas on how to do this right so that it's privacy preserving and risk aware solutions. Over to you, Alan.
You just mentioned crowdsourcing ideas, which of course, complements, I think, Jade's comment on open source, bring more people into the conversation that provides more opportunity to be part of the solution to think through what these challenges are. Was there any interesting idea through this crowdsourcing mechanism, something that popped up in your mind that you went, wow, we wouldn't have thought about that if you didn't do the crowdsource?
Yeah, no, I'll give you an example. Like, we constantly talk about the first line of defense, and in the GRC vernacular, the first line of defense is, your organizations and, kind of your lines of business. As I was talking to, a number of our customers, one of the things that came up was, how can you actually use the system, the GRC system, not just containing it to the GRC professionals or the audit universe or people who are in the compliance groups, but how do you take it to the first line where it can actually be bubbling up the risks in a simple way? And that, while it sounds very intuitive, But when you're, talking to head of risk of large banks who have over 200,000 employees around the world, getting that risk intelligence coming from the first line in a simple way, not just through web interface, not just through mobile apps, but actually in text and SMS, that is an important part of making it universal. So that risk is capture becomes universal and bidirectional. So that means you capture the risk from the first line, but you also push back some recommendations back to an employee who's maybe working in a high risk area to say, please don't go there, or consider the risks. And so providing that, what I call, interface, which is really simple to the first line, becomes an imperative.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Gunjan. We're out of time. So thank you very much, Gunjan. Thank you, Jade. I really appreciate the conversation. This is a very strange time. We're in a strange mechanism for this conference, but through some of the mechanisms you talked about, I think we're well on our way in improving our ability to meet the challenges provided by this pandemic. And so thank you both, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
And thank you, Alan. Thank you, Jade.
Thank you.